And thanks everyone for joining. This is the World Ocean Council meeting of our roundtable on ocean restoration and CO2 removal and blue carbon. We've got a sort of growing and expanding level of interest in this, and growing sort of scope that we're making sure we capture in terms of the future of the ocean and CO2 removal in both coastal and ocean systems. And a lot of our efforts to date have been focused more on the ocean side of things, but then the blue carbon aspect is something that a lot of you have been probably familiar with for a long time, and certainly myself been tracking this for many years. Really linking this back in a more purposeful way, as we talked about in our last meeting, the last several meetings, is what we'll focus on today, and particularly in the context of the World Ocean Council, the business and investment situation and opportunities. So to get things started, with these, we got people coming in, just making sure everyone gets in. We invite, no obligation, but invite those of you that are new to the roundtable to introduce yourselves with just a quick statement of who you are, your affiliation, and a few words on your interest in the topic area of ocean restoration, carbon dioxide removal, and or blue carbon. So I can't see everyone who's on the call. So if any of those that are new would like to jump in and introduce themselves, please do so.
Yeah, I'm happy to go first. So hi all, I'm Mike Davies. I'm a co-founder of Biodiversity and Ecosystem Futures. So a UK social enterprise focusing on enabling greater finance for emission reduction projects, and also improving the tracking and transacting of carbon credits. And we're looking more into blue carbon now. So really keen to hear the conversation today.
Thanks, Mike. Other new participants that would like to introduce themselves?
Hello, I'll go. My name's Emily. I've just started interning with Simply Blue Group, who are an early stage developer of sustainable marine projects. I'm working with Christoph Harwood, who is Managing Director of Aquaculture, and we're looking at carbon capture within the company, more specifically seaweed and kelp farming and capture, and how we can go forward with that. So thank you for letting me join and listen in.
Thanks, Emily. And Chris has been a participant in the previous editions of the, so it's great to have you here as well. And I'll just note that Simply Blue is also a World Ocean Council member, which is great. Great to have members here. So other new participants that would like to introduce themselves? Okay. Well, good to have you all that are continuing to be involved here. With that, I will, this is our quick, simple agenda here, but we want to really get into the presentation from Steve Crooks, principal in Silvestrum, and one of the real leading lights and personal knowledge banks on blue carbon and everything about blue carbon. So I will stop sharing screen here and hand the floor platform over to you, Steve.
Great, thank you very much, Paul. And thank you very much for the invitation to join you today. And round table, this is exciting. Okay. I don't see my screen. What do you see, Paul, right now?
I see an ad for a credit card.
Oh, apparently. I see what's going. Yes, that's not very good. That's my email. So
that's okay. Is that your sponsor, Steve?
I'm always willing to have sponsors, finance institutions. Okay.
We've got it's a bit small in that there's a big text box on the left. There we go. That's great.
Okay, great. So I'm going to give you an update on where things are for blue carbon. I'll give a bit of a background to those of you who might be quite new to the topic, and then we'll get into some of the status. And you know, the overarching aspect is that in the last 10 years, we've been building the enabling environment, building a lot of awareness. And now we're both moving into operationalizing a lot of blue carbon management activities in coastal systems through different finance mechanisms, but also expanding the range of blue carbon ecosystems to ones that have not been included until now. Just a bit of background on myself. I come from an environmental restoration background, been working in that for 30 years. Been involved in blue carbon since the beginning of the concept. I wrote the first white paper with colleagues on the potential to turn tidal wetlands restoration into an offsets mechanism for the Climate Action Reserve 15 years ago. Was involved with the IPCC in developing the greenhouse gas accounting guidance, the Wetland Supplement 2013. And we've worked a lot with VERA, Verified Carbon Standard, to develop methodologies for peatlands, for coastal wetlands, both the restoration, BM33, and then the conservation modules and the RED methodology, BM7. And we're helping various partners with project development. And then we're also working with VERA, I'll tell you more about this in a little while, and thinking about extending landscape approaches to the seascape and including seaweed, aquaculture, etc., into potential carbon project development. But there's a few steps to move there. So with that, I'll start delving in. Right, so 10 years ago or so, we started raising awareness about the potential for, or the need for coastal ecosystems to be included within international climate mitigation frameworks. There had been a lot of resistance to that previously, and even then when we started. But what we wanted to do was push forests. Well, we work on forests for a number of decades. Peatlands were starting to become a discussion point because recognizing the soil management. And we were pushing the argument that we should extend terrestrial frameworks that were being developed like RED and other climate mitigation strategies under the UNFCCC, get people comfortable, get their feet wet, and move into the coastal and marine environment. Because a lot of the principles for mangrove, salt marsh, and seagrass is weakly transferable from terrestrial frameworks that have been developed. We recognized at the time that more marine ecosystems like the kelps and aquaculture and open marine, they required both different types of climate mitigation frameworks that would be developed by the UNFCCC at the time. And so they were not ready, but also the science wasn't ready. And so there needed to be some development of the science there. And in fact, for these ecosystems, there was a lot of work needed to be done on the science. And so that's what we've been working with others and other groups have been doing, is building the science so that we can actually develop good mitigation frameworks. So coastal ecosystems, I'm just going to say this, you should all, I'm sure you all know, massively important for many types of environmental and social benefits, from fisheries, coastal protection, water quality. You can read the list. Where do people go when they feel down? They want to be in nature. People particularly want to be in the coastal environment. And one additional benefit is carbon sequestration. And when we look at carbon sequestration, carbon really is the currency that underpins a lot of ecosystem services. It supplies food for fisheries and birds. When you look at this photograph here, these fish are the same age. And the fish on the right have been grown in a wetland. They were in cages, held in a channel that had wetlands feeding a carbon supply. The fish on the left are from a channel, same age, without a wetland carbon supply. And so you can see how carbon feeds through the food chain to support the coastal ecosystems. And that's what's really important, both not only the size of the fisheries, but the size of the fish in the fisheries. Of course, they provide CO2 sequestration, seagrasses from the water column, other plants from the atmosphere. Seagrass and kelp help with ocean acidification amelioration in local settings, which is really important, particularly around oyster reefs, oyster fisheries, coral. But it's also the carbon which binds coastal systems together and helps them build against sea level rise. It's an important part of actual adaptation and resilience against climate change. This is what coastal systems look like. And this is actually a marsh not far from my house. And you can see this, it represents maybe about 1 meter of sediment accumulation. It's a very mineral system, but you can see the carbon that's buried. As long as the sediments are maintained wet, and these marshes are building with sea level, then they accumulate carbon constantly through time. Unlike other ecosystems like terrestrial forests, which will eventually reach peak storage, coastal ecosystems continue. And the same with mangroves, and to some degree, the same also with seagrasses as well. This is an old slide, but the principles still hold true. You know, when you look at the distribution of carbon within these ecosystems, the green represents living biomass above ground and below ground. And then the brown represents what's in the soil. And so you find that even for, you know, mangrove systems where the trees could be enormous, that most of the carbon is in the soil. So you're underestimating it if you only think about the biomass. And the amount of carbon is greater per unit area than, say, a tropical forest. But of course, forests have much greater extent. So this is a per unit area basis. So that whatever you can do within coastal systems on a per unit area basis has a bigger impact. Has a big impact. Drilling down into the data a bit more, if you look into different, so basically from 12 o'clock round to 3 o'clock represents what's in the biomass. This is for Yap and for Kalimantan, so right in the tropics there. Most of the carbon is in the soil. So when we think about management strategies, you have to think about soil management strategies, not just biomass.
Steve, if I could just say, because you've got the, I don't know if everyone else is seeing this, I'm seeing the next slide, and so it's taking up,
okay, let's see how
maybe to go full view if it's possible.
What does this do?
No. Yeah, but I don't want to mess you up here, but.
No,
just hit display settings at the top and switch to the other option. Sorry, I just did this morning.
Awesome, thank you. I got it?
Yeah, yep.
Sweet, thanks very much.
Right, you've got such good data here. You just want to make sure we don't miss it.
No, I appreciate that. Right, similar sort of thing, but this is a global look. Dark bars are carbon in the soil, the light bars, carbon in the biomass. So from the Indo-Pacific to the Arabian Peninsula, you find the same principles. Even if the total stock varies, the same principles hold true. And so what is happening, what has happened around the world is that we're getting conversion of coastal wetlands to something else. And quite often that something else in the tropics is aquaculture, or it could be palm. It's a very, very large coastal. And so everything you see here, this is a part of Indonesia, used to be mangrove forest, which is now shrimp ponds. And so you get this destruction, which has been taking place and still continues. And when you do this kind of land use change, this is actually data from the Dominican Republic. No matter what, whether you have tall mangroves, dwarf mangroves, most of the carbon's in the soil. And then you see here with a shrimp pond that you can lose, 3,000 on average, 3,000 tons of CO2 per hectare when you convert these lands to shrimp ponds. And so shrimp ponds, they may have a life, depending on where you are, of only less than 10 years. And then it's pretty much the equivalent of slash and burn agriculture, where you just move on to the next location. And this is why they have so much trouble in Indonesia and why they have such huge emissions there. So we want to try and get to grips with land use management within these coastal systems. This is all data, very popular. This paper has been downloaded now 50,000 times. We estimated what the global emissions were from these coastal ecosystems, and including seagrasses and including tidal marshes as well as mangroves. And we came up with a number which seems to be holding true of about 450 million tons per year of ongoing emissions, that each new emissions every year from these coastal ecosystems. That rate has probably declined in the last decade, because I think since we've been raising awareness on this, we've seen a reduction in losses of mangroves in the last 10 years compared to the 10 years before. So that is heartening. So we've been building this enabling environment through the Blue Carbon Initiative and other initiatives, but the Blue Carbon Initiative is extremely key in this. So we have established protocols for sampling in the field and for laboratory analysis. This was something that was asked for from countries and also people in the private sector, so that we could compare apples to apples and make sure our monitoring, reporting, and verification was robust. And so that exists. Oh, and here's just some photographs. If you ever want to get in the mud and come to the mangroves, avoid the tigers in some countries, or avoid the crocodiles in others. But there are standard approaches for how to collect the data, then how to sample, subsample it, cutting the core, sampling depth intervals. And then similar sorts of things for if you want to help us collect data from seagrass beds, requires a bit more effort. and then how to sample it and the kinds of information that you need. So we have standardized techniques for data collection. We incorporated a lot of this. Back in 2011, we asked a very naive question at the first COP we went to. Given all these emissions, where were the IPCC in this? How come they were ignoring this activity? And the IPCC actually were in the room and asked us to help them think through coastal wetlands and including coastal wetlands in greenhouse gas accounting guidance. They were already looking at other forms of wetland, but hadn't included coastal wetlands in their planning up until that point. So a piece of great luck led to the inclusion of coastal wetlands in this accounting guidance. And now countries are obliged to include this guidance by 2024. A number of countries have already started doing this, including the US. And that's one of my jobs, to include coastal wetlands within the US inventory, but also working in other countries to do similar. And so that's really important because countries are starting to measure this through their greenhouse gas inventory. They're looking for finance mechanisms under their NDCs, and they're looking for ways to reduce their greenhouse gas impacts. And we've been working with groups like the Smithsonian to develop data portals and tools. And so now for transparency, I was literally just on a presentation 20 minutes ago with the State Department and looking at using tools like this to help countries think about their inventory compilation. So that the Smithsonian have this Coastal Carbon Data Atlas, where it is available to all countries to use. We're going to be creating interfaces so that inventory compilers and carbon project developers can access the data. They can upload their own data, and we can develop reference stocks, emissions factors, and the like. So lots of enabling has been taking place. And so we're really ready now to develop projects. And key to that, if you want to try and get carbon finance, is being connected to a standard, and particularly to a good standard. And so, as I mentioned, Verra approved first an update to their standard in 2011 to recognize wetlands restoration and conservation. We helped them with that. And also with the development of the restoration methodology, VM33, which is being applied around, now in carbon projects. And also with an update to the RED methodology, VM7, which now includes peatlands and coastal wetlands. And these things are always evolving, and potentially they may be merged together into a single blue carbon methodology for restoration and conservation determined. So the enabling environment is there. And so projects are now starting to come online. We've seen a few, but the pipeline for projects still remains very small because the people who are engaged in coastal wetlands tend not to know much about carbon markets. The people who are engaged in carbon markets don't tend to know much about coastal wetlands. And so there's been, people gradually putting their toes into the water here and moving towards developing projects. The first ones were community projects in Kenya and Madagascar, using a small-scale Plan Vivo methodology, which is good for communities, but you really need a more robust methodology for large projects. The Indus project is a really exciting one. It's going through validation actually this week, and it's a partnership between the Sindh government and Indus Delta Capital, and Wade Sylvester have been helping them get over the line with the process of documenting the document, the project, and getting it into shape ready for validation and crediting, submission to the verified carbon standard. And so I'll show you a few pictures of this. This is an enormous project, 225,000 hectares of mangrove reforestation. What's not in here yet is the conservation project, which we separated out. And there's potentially a next phase also in neighboring lands for more reforestation in the Indus Delta. It's in the Indus Delta in Pakistan. The project is going to run for 60 years, though they have actually been planting mangroves there for 30 years. So there is a track record of successful mangrove replanting. It started small. They have the world record for planting 1 million mangroves in one day. There's a lot of labor available in Pakistan. And the intent is to plant 1 billion mangrove trees under this phase within the next within 12 years. And it's estimated over the life of the project that they will remove 127 million tons of CO2. And that's accounting for sea level rise and wetlands migration, which we had to model. We're hopefully crediting the first 1 million tons this year, which is based upon emissions over the last, plantings over the last 5 years. We estimate 5 million tons, an additional 5 million tons in 5 years, and then 30 million tons 5 years after that, as the number of trees, as the trees grow and the number of areas increase. Just to show you where it is in the scale, there it is in Pakistan. The blue on this graphic is areas which have been planted already, and the other colors are different areas which are intended to be planted in the next coming few years. And there's a photograph of what this plantation on the left-hand side. There is a 5-year-old plantation next to the village of Kiti Bandar, where it provides an amount of shoreline stabilization. And just to comment upon this, and you know, the restoration is really important to the local community. They are fishers as well as rice farmers, and they've seen the decline in the fisheries. They have to go out to sea further and further. And so they are very enthusiastic about the mangrove restoration. I'll talk about some of the other community benefits in a moment. Well, maybe I'll move on to that. But they have seen the fisheries start to come back already. You know, within the project area, which is 350,000 hectares of 220,000 hectares being planted, we have 60 coastal villages included, which covers 42,000 people. Fishing is largely the largest resource, but there was also grazing. Interesting, if you ever go to a wetland in Pakistan to see camels, like 10 miles out to sea, as well as buffalo and cattle. The population really is on the poverty line, and there is a lack of safe drinking water in there. You know, some of the villages we went to, they had 90% hepatitis within the community, for example, and the lack of basic education, healthcare services, and the like. And so, where part of the financing will go to will be to support community improvements, such as access to medical facilities and access to clean drinking water, which is really, really important in communities like this. So where are we in terms of global project status? You know, even though I'm talking about one big project here, we really have a lack of projects. They take quite some time to develop. And people who have been interested in projects have not necessarily been familiar with the development process. So they need help to be getting off the ground. We also need to have good screening, due diligence. Not all areas make good carbon finance projects. They might be good for other reasons, but you don't have the long-term permanence in some locations. So it's important to screen those out, and or think about a phased approach if you're working in those areas. We need to build the experience of project developers, and so they can have the experience to move forward. And one of the challenges is still the political environment and the regulatory environment. It's still not clear where countries are going to be on Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And Article 6, part of that, provides for international transfer of mitigation options. So basically the international carbon market. And in some levels, countries are hoping to recognize the emissions reductions under their own NDC. But at the same time, they're interested in financing coming from overseas. And what's been really interesting is the extent to which we've seen private finance really engage just in the last 2 years. You know, when we started writing these methodologies just over 10 years ago, you know, you talk to Macquarie Bank or others and they say, oh, you know, we want to transact and, you know, get in and out within a 2-year period. And organizations were not interested in helping develop methodologies which would create projects down the line. They just wanted to transact. But now we're seeing patient capital come in. And we're talking to funds measured in tens to hundreds of millions of dollars who are interested in, you know, near-term trading of credits, but also in terms of investing down the line in innovative activities coming online, and also more speculative activities also. There's also a whole interest in blended capital approaches and blended financing and public-private partnerships outside of carbon markets or including it. But There's a lot more interest right now in trying to make this happen. And what's interesting is that the private sector is offering a better price than the REDD programs. And I think really it's an interesting transition right now. The private sector is stepping up where things were supported by big multinational activities like slow-moving REDD. It's interesting now to see private sector really taking the reins here and moving forward. And then, oh, those right there. And the range of organizations becoming involved include private capital groups, tech companies, a lot of interest from tech companies, CORSIA, airlines now thinking about CORSIA. Similarly, the shipping agencies, they see this on the horizon, shipping companies and energy companies, as well as others. But certainly, you know, the organizations with the deep pockets and also the deep requirements for emissions reductions are starting to express interest in blue carbon, not just for the carbon offsets, but also for the social environmental benefits. So I did mention, you know, this is what's on the horizon, is really expanding to including other ecosystems, to including the whole seascape. And Envera right now is exploring and taking steps to doing that. They've done an enormous amount of work. Envera is the most robust of all voluntary carbon standards. And they have approaches for landscape carbon management and a whole bunch of methodologies under that. And now there's interested to think about, you know, what would it take to develop a seascape carbon crediting framework? So this allows us to think about new types of ecosystems. And seaweed aquaculture is really interesting, both in terms of the byproduct of growing the seaweed, and then you can put it on land and use it for various benefits, which then themselves might have knock-on greenhouse gas emissions reductions opportunities. But also maybe in terms of industrial scale activities, which some are thinking about in the open ocean. You know, should we just be growing seaweed to sink it in the ocean as a means of carbon sequestration? There's a lot to think about there. I'll come back to that in a sec. But we're also interested in kelp conservation and restoration. You know, can that be done? Oyster reef restoration and conservation, and seabed management, avoided trawling. You know, if you reduce trawling to an area, then does that lead to a carbon benefits? And you may have seen some papers on these topics recently. Now, the science on all of this is still in development. So right now we're creating the framework with Verra so that when the science is ready, it can insert into methodologies to develop into carbon credits. Seaweed farming, kelp conservation restoration are probably the closest right now. There are groups like Ocean Visions and Oceans 2050. If you were here last month for Megan's presentation, you know, it illustrates the work that's going on in that field to quickly build the science to help support that. And so we're going to be developing a methodology to connect that to the carbon market. If it's ready, the science is ready. On these other topics of oyster reef restoration, conservation, seabed management, they're not there yet. And so we're hoping to create the enabling environment so that the scientists can plug in and we can start talking with project developers and governments about starting to recognize these kind of activities. So if we think about a country with a marine protected area system, how can they recognize the whole carbon benefit of that entire marine protected area and start layering in different finance mechanisms, be it carbon finance, other types of finance to help make that happen. So make this whole thing functional. And so the kind of questions we have, you know, that will need to be answered related to the science, the quantification. We need to think about safeguards. And so we need to pull in folks with that kind of experience. Like if you do put out really expansive areas of aquaculture, what are the negative impacts about that? Are you extracting too many nutrients from the water column? Are you impacting whale populations? What other things do we need to think about that we need to mitigate? And, you know, we can learn from experience that's already out there. The Chinese, for example, have got very extensive aquaculture and no environmental safeguards. And then we have the Scandinavians, which are also exploring aquaculture and are very focused on safeguards. And then we have the US market, the North American market, which really doesn't have much of an aquaculture industry right now, but is certainly interested. We're seeing a lot of entrepreneurs exploring this. And then, of course, there's the legal and the financial viability, which need to be thought about. These will come along. I thought I had another slide of, oh, there we are. Opportunities and barriers. Where can organizations like you maybe fit in? As I said, the pipeline is very nascent. The amount of interest far outstrips the project available. So we need to develop the project pipeline. I need a better word than pipeline for green stuff. Support project identification, development, and also support developers. And the importance of patient finance, looking down the line, as well as near-term opportunities. So you will see, for instance, credits becoming available on projects like the Indus project, the projects in Colombia coming online, but we really need patient finance also. Pay a decent price for carbon credits. I think right now the floor is around about $15 a ton. We're seeing $15 commonly being paid being offered for blue carbon projects. It's still well below the social cost of carbon, and so hopefully that will increase. If you're only interested in carbon offsets and not the environmental sort, go look at wind farms. But if you want to engage in supporting natural climate solutions, then do look to blue carbon credits. Technology opportunities. When we get into open ocean work, and also energy of the fleet is a big issue. And so developing renewable energy sources for marine fleets is important, would be helpful. Other forms of technology to improve aquaculture or MRV work, monitoring, reporting, and verification. More broadly, opportunities to look for nature-based or natural climate solutions within your operations. A lot of interest right now, for instance, in thinking about port facilities and how you manage sediment. What can you do beneficially with that sediment to recover wetlands or reduce the greenhouse or reduce the footprint of dredging activities and reuse of sediment. And then look also to your greenhouse gas impacts of your supply chain, particularly if you're engaged in things like palm and shrimp. Shrimp and palm are probably the biggest land use impacts per unit area in terms of the climate. And so if there's ways of reducing those impacts, then it'd be very helpful to think about that. And then also outside of carbon finance, opportunities for public-private financing. For instance, development projects within coastal systems. When you think about the landscape, how can you bring in natural climate solutions into development projects, reducing the impact of individual structures and facilities, but also recovering the environment at the same time to have both a beneficial economic impact and also beneficial environmental impact at the same time. And I think, yes, with that, I'd be very happy to, of course, take questions right now, but follow up with anybody afterwards if you'd like to continue the discussion. Thank you for your time.
Thanks so much, Steve. Excuse me. Very, very good, very comprehensive. And, if there's anything to be known, we know that you're aware of it. So great to have you presenting all this here. So I'll get out of the way here and just open the floor up for questions and comments from this excellent overview from Steve. I'm sure with the sorts of people we have on the call here, some important points to follow up on. So floor is open. And I don't have it set up to see everyone, so people can sort of just jump in and raise your hands if you want, but go ahead and let's just have an open discussion here.
Hi, this is Jim Stewart. So what is the kind of money, did I hear you say that you could get $50 a ton of carbon, Steve? Is that possible?
Well, we're getting 15 right now.
1.5.
Oh,
1.5. Yeah,
but I thought that the European carbon market was closer to $50 right now.
Well, there's quite a range. And so the European market is over $50. They have not been engaging directly yet in any of the few blue carbon projects which are out there. But they are a good model for that. We're working right now in also Canada. We're working with the coastal First Nations to look at developing seaweed farming there into the first carbon project under the Verra methodology.
What kind of price in Canada?
Well, the Canadian government is projecting that their system is going to be over 100 Canadian dollars within 10 years. So per credit. So, you know, they're looking to that as sort of a direction of how things are going. And then it gets interesting, but what we're seeing now is I think companies are seeing this kind of growth in terms of price. And so we're getting, you know, the types of companies I've just mentioned, they're more interested now in locking in credits. So we might see projects not even go to market. You know, they'll go through the process, but the early investors will just use the credits, will use the offsets for their own internal emissions reductions programs rather than trading them. Some will be interested in trading them, of course, but it's what we are seeing is that, you know, some of these, let's say, energy companies, they may not be interested in trading the credits at all.
Yeah, but you're saying that the companies are only willing to pay $15 a ton at this point.
At this point, yes. Yeah.
But you said Canada. When would Canada be providing more money?
Well, I have to try and remember the exact of the detail. I think it's the carbon tax system. They want to put a tax on it by 2030, I think, of over $100. I forget the details right now.
Thanks.
Steve, Brian. Yeah, Brian von Herzen from the Climate Foundation. I was interested in your distinction between framework and methodology. And could you outline briefly the steps that you see as perhaps the most critical in methodology development for some of these various coastal blue carbon approaches?
Yeah, so we want to create a framework first so that rather than moving forward in a disconnected way with methodologies, we want to make sure that they're all consistent across from one methodology to the other and how we deal with issues of permanence, leakage, and quantification and MRV. And so we're going to be looking at that quite broadly. And then for individual methodologies that might come online, and there may be other methodologies which come online beyond the ones I listed, but I think we're trying to cover the main topics right now. We have to think about, you know, the subjects I just mentioned, like additionality.
That sounds great. Yeah, we've been working along the lines of this framework development as well, and I think there's a great opportunity to really document in an integrated way what goes into sediments, what goes into deep ocean, the median time to outcropping of these deep waters, and really helping people understand that the oceans are not monolithic, that the median time to outcropping of water 300 or 1,000 meters below the surface is distinctly different than the epipelagic or sunlight zone.
Yeah, let's keep in touch, Brian, and we can follow up with this.
I look forward to
that. Other questions or comments for Steve? Just to follow up from Brian's point and something I wanted to ask about, Steve, then in terms of the sort of the standards and the methodology landscape or ecosystem out there, do you see, I mean, how do you see that evolving in terms of the size and scale of the need and opportunity out there, and the you know, the pipeline? I like your point about maybe we need a better word than that. The project development, how does that match up with the overall, how does the availability of methodology and the potential to apply the methodology and apply standards match up with the enormity of the opportunities out there, the potential projects?
Yes. Well, without a methodology, and without a methodology being recognized by a standard, then you have no project. You know, you can go out, for instance, let's say plant mangroves and informally recognize the benefits of those mangroves within your CSR program, for example. But it's the methodology that allows you to have official offsets and recognize them officially and make sure it helps avoid double counting. And
go ahead, Steve.
Sorry. There is a very useful distinction that came up yesterday, and that is we really need to talk about reduced emissions on the one hand, and in a completely separate category of drawdown technologies, and really keep those. I really like the approach of having two balance sheets. There's income and there are expenses, but those aren't mixed in general. And that moves us away from offsets to some extent. Pardon me, sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, Brian, good input.
Yeah, and so, you know, the methodologies exist for the intertidal systems. They need to be developed for the ocean systems, and recognizing the downdraw is part of that. So that's a critical first step to be done. You know, the voluntary markets is where the innovation takes place. You know, it's mostly bottom up. And once things are standardized, then they tend to move, or they have the opportunity to move into the compliance market, which is where the greater number of tons are in terms of you know, transactions. But we're seeing, you know, a lot of interest from big organizations in buying credits from the voluntary market. And so we'll see how that all evolves into the future. But like I say, you know, big energy companies coming in, other big buyers, and the amount of credits that they want, or the amount of offsets that they want, is really far greater than the amount of projects that we have right now. And so a large part of what our little company is trying to do is expand to try and help meet that demand. So we're trying to work with various organizations from the Coastal First Nations to groups in various countries around the world to help them develop projects and help them, you know, bring them to market. But there is a need for a real step up in availability of projects.
And just to follow on in terms of the methodologies, so although the voluntary carbon market and those involved in that are driving the innovation and the creating of the standards, the methodologies themselves, the important point, if I understand the system or the situation correctly, then having those come out of the UNFCCC formal process is essential to having a credible methodology from which to move forward on.
Yeah, that's right. That's right, Paul.
And does that provide, is that creating a bottleneck at all, or do you see that UNFCCC process as being, you know, ready and able to handle the expansion of methodologies for a broader suite of habitats and ecosystems?
Well, it's not there yet. You know, there's certainly, you know, since the Ocean Pathway was announced, that's been a real driver in thinking about ocean systems. But we have nothing into the UNFCCC process about how to recognize these broader coastal ecosystems, these broader marine ecosystems within greenhouse gas accounting. So even if a country wants to do it, they don't have a way of reporting it to the international community. You know, they could say it's happening, but it's not fully recognized. And so it's difficult to capture under an NDC. And NDCs are really the lightning rod for financing for countries. And so a critical next step, and, you know, as I say, we were very lucky at the beginning to engage with the IPCC, and the science was there to do that. The next step would be to do the same again with the IPCC and go back and say, let's get these marine ecosystems into the greenhouse gas accounting frameworks so that countries can build upon that. And so what we're hoping to do here is through work with the Verified Carbon Standard is to create an energy to build the science to encourage inclusion of this within the IPCC. And hence the conversations just on the last discussion with the State Department and others about the importance of funding more science on this topic.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought that the Paris Accords allowed each nation under the NDCs to account for ocean carbon using their own approaches. Isn't there some language like that?
I don't think it's terribly clear in that regard. Really, you know, somebody might correct me, I might be wrong in this regard. But I think that it's really strengthened by having, you know, it recognized by the IPCC as a greenhouse gas emissions reducible.
I think it's good. I mean, the positive side is oceans finally got mentioned in Paris.
Yeah.
So we have a hook. We have a word, a couple of words in the Paris Accord that says, yes, nations can use oceans for what they're doing. And then I imagine the IPCC can greatly strengthen, based on that ledge, that's been provided, greatly strengthen in detail more as to what can be done with NDCs to really establish that more fully. By the way, I did have a thought on replacing pipelines, and that is in economics, we talk about value chains, and in our marine ecosystems, we talk about nutrient value chains, since macronutrients and micronutrients are the currency by which species and ecosystems exchange goods and services and energy.
Very good, thank you. You know, on the Paris aspect, I was an advisor to the French government on where blue carbon could fit into the Paris Agreement. And as we were going into the meeting, as we were preparing for the meeting, their preference at the time was to only focus on mangroves and because they could get their arms around that. And where we got to at the end of the discussions was not to focus on any particular ecosystem, but to leave the door open to countries to come forward with, you know, any ecosystem that they could work with for greenhouse gas emissions reductions. And so the terminology that came out in the agreement was broad and encompassing, so that just like everything else within the Paris Agreement, it's a bottom-up framework. And so it allows countries really to find their own pathway in terms of ecosystems. But that all said, you know, it goes back to, we need to get it into the IPCC greenhouse gas accounting to really fully operationalize that.
Sounds good, and great work on at least getting the hooks in place into the Paris Accord so that we could build on that in the future. So kudos for that.
Thanks, Steve. Other comments or questions?
I only had a comment to say how lucky that you mentioned that with the IPCC being in the meeting and you were able to hook up with them and that you're working on standardizing the methodology. Our project is deep ocean, phytoplankton fertilization. And I'm just wondering who your contact is, so that if and when we close with a corporate customer, which is our goal right now, we're working hard to do, I would like to, with our advising scientists, begin to develop a standardized methodology for measuring CO2 removed from phytoplankton fertilization. So I don't know if you could pass me that contact when I reach that step, but I would like to definitely work on that.
That's great, Salvador. Please feel free to keep in touch with me or Amy Schmidt, who's, I see her name here, from the Verified Carbon Standard, and we'll connect you in to how things are developing on the framework.
Will do. Thank you.
Yeah.
What I'd like to suggest on that, Salvador and Steve, is that I think having a broad, diverse, there will be strength in having a broad, diverse community of players putting this sort of stuff forward to UNFCCC and the IPCC in particular. And I'd suggest that using the World Ocean Council platform, since we're covering the whole range of as a not-for-profit that's accredited by a whole range of UN entities, that we could really go on together, and we are accredited at UNFCCC and so on. So I think this is, and that was where I wanted to go a little bit with that earlier point, Steve, was whether there is and should be really a sort of a coordinated effort to bring this stuff forward in a comprehensive, systematic way, particularly from the private sector side, to say the business and investment community, is ready, willing, and able to move forward on this, on these coastal and ocean ecosystems and their carbon sequestration potential, their carbon credit potential. And here's the things we need from governments and the intergovernmental community in terms of the IPCC side of things and the science, the methodology development, et cetera, and really put forward that kind of action agenda to, as you say, deal with the enabling conditions for that critical part that the governments and especially the intergovernmental mechanisms need to address. And I'd be interested in your thoughts on, how we might do that, and how the World Ocean Council can facilitate and catalyze that as a way to help rise all boats with a rising tide on this. And then different companies, different service providers, different researchers, and so on can then play their part based on the intergovernmental process really taking up its role in a way that will facilitate all of those conditions being put in place.
It's a really great point there, Paul. And I think your opportunity to be present at the COPs, and particularly the next COP coming up, is really helpful. Having panels and perspectives from industry and is so key at the COPs, because when we were starting a lot of this blue carbon work, it was seen as if just like an NGO conservation interest, and some scientists, and I think really having an expression of interest from industry, both in terms of wanting more projects on the ground from existing types of what's available, but also these new technologies. One of the exciting things about seaweed farming is it's an industry. It brings jobs, it brings economic development, which is different to, say, you're conserving, let's say, a seagrass somewhere, a mangrove. It brings an industry. And so having the voice of industry at the COPs, I think, carries a lot of sway. They will want to see science developed, etc. But being present from an industry point of view, seeing there's a demand for this is so important, particularly how it links to blue economies and all of that. So I look forward to seeing you there, Paul, and the World Ocean Council, and whoever else you want to bring along.
Well, we may, we might want to think about in the run-up to the COP26, and this is one of our sort of ongoing agenda items the last few months, is if, what, and how to do things there. But perhaps taking the sort of discussion we're having here and broadening it out to be, the overall ocean and coastal ecosystem sequestration and potential, and really organizing a discussion or two about what business and the business and investment community would want to put forward at the COP, and so kind of get ourselves organized as a private sector community of practice around ocean and coastal carbon sequestration and carbon credit development, et cetera. Kind of the discussion we're having here, but in a more structured way to then put that package together of what is needed from governments and the intergovernmental process and the UNFCCC, and then that feeds into the agenda for a side event specifically on that, to say, well, here's what needs to be developed in the agenda and outputs from the intergovernmental process to really accelerate and ensure that we've got all the enabling conditions in place. So that's we can maybe do that as a focus of this roundtable. So I'd be interested, we'll sketch out some ideas and come back to this the roundtable group that is 80 or so that we have on our mailing list now, and really see where people feel the need and opportunity is there to have a more structured intersection with the UNFCCC process and the COP26.
Yeah. Indeed, I say that the time is ripe. I would say, try and have big ambitions, bring big ideas, and have big asks.
Yeah. Yeah. Any other thoughts or comments for Steve? Okay, I don't know, not to put you on the spot, Amy, but I don't know if you wanted to add anything to what Steve mentioned about the work, the expansion of the work that's going on at Verra and into the broader sort of seascape level situation. And if not, fine, but I just thought I'd give you the opportunity since he did bring up Verra a few times.
Yeah, thanks. I think Steve pretty well covered it, but yeah, just to say that we are looking into being able to support these activities under the VCS program, and some of our experience with other types of projects have led us to want to do this in kind of a holistic way and make sure that we're thinking about these different marine and seascape management activities kind of at a high level, so we can set out similar accounting frameworks for methodologies to be developed, rather than having differences in accounting or how they're considering the baseline or leakage across these different types of projects or different activity types.
Thanks, Amy, and it's really great to have your participation here. And certainly that's a big part of what's going on is, an important part of what's going on is the role of the standards organizations as facilitators and verifiers of the results of these projects. So I see there's some interesting thoughts in the chat on the alternatives to the word pipeline, Steve. So you sparked a movement here. Okay, well, with that, we'll move on to other parts of the agenda and the broader work and role of the roundtable here and this community of practice. It's been gradually developing at the World Ocean Council and where we want to go with things moving forward. We do have, in terms of the content for coming sessions of the roundtable, I'll just mention a little bit of a teaser to say that we do have some of the finance investors involved in the carbon, ocean and coastal carbon space that will be speaking or lining up and actually very interested to come speak. So we'll be setting that up. I will, again, thanks very much, Steve. And I will put the agenda back on the screen and we'll pick up with some of the other aspects of what we've been working on here. We have already talked about COP26 a bit. We're in touch with a number of players, Ocean Visions, and I guess Brad's not on the call today, but and they had their event last week, of which Ocean CDR was one of the key sessions, and some of the other key entities involved in COP26 regarding if and how the Ocean CDR will be a part of the program there and what sort of side events we might organize. And as we've just talked about, I think there's some real opportunities and as Steve highlighted, some real opportunities to use that event as a place to really get help ensure that the governments and the UNFCCC are well informed on the developments, the needs, the opportunities for advancing ocean and coastal carbon dioxide removal and blue carbon. So that's I don't know if there's any thoughts from those of you that are involved in that process or have been or see the need to be other things that you would want to highlight in terms of what you would like to see happening in terms of the intergovernmental process in overall and in particular with the COP26. I don't know if John, really, if I could put you on the spot there, just any thoughts from your point of view, having been a longstanding WC member and longstanding proponent of ocean carbon sequestration in ocean ecosystems and restoration in terms of the intergovernmental landscape, not necessarily just COP26, but in terms of the sort of the policy framework and conditions that that we should be bringing to the attention of governments?
Not really, Paul, but I think the COP being in the UK is a really important opportunity because the UK have just done analysis of their ocean CDR potential for UK territorial waters. So I think the UK are going to be driving this topic, and I think, as Steve says, just having the business community there will make a big difference. I don't think we're going to be traveling from Australia to the UK in November. I don't think we'll be allowed out of Australia.
Right.
But yeah, no, I think it's a slow process, isn't it? But bringing the different aspects of blue carbon and ocean CDR together is going to be powerful, I think. So yeah, I think just bringing the private sector to the meeting will be good.
If actually thinking back to our discussion a few minutes ago and linking to the COP26, Steve or anyone, thoughts on who in the intergovernmental system there from IPCC or the UNFCCC Secretariat would be, if we could bring someone from that ecosystem to the roundtable to really help us brief us on what's going on and where things are going and how we can, as a business and investment community best input into and help shape the agenda and drive things forward. Any thoughts right now, or certainly as a follow-up by email, on who we should be reaching out to there? I mean, I have interacted with Patricia Espinosa, the head of the UNFCCC Secretariat, off and on over the years, but is there someone in particular within the workings there that might be best to engage with us here in this community?
Paul, this is Megan. There's a UNFCCC champion for the oceans, Ignace.
Oh, right. Yeah. At Global Compact. Yep.
Yeah. There's just a suggestion.
Thank you. Yeah. Good point.
Yes. There's also the fellow, the ocean ambassador from Fiji. Gosh, I forgot his name, which is embarrassing of me.
You mean
Peter Thompson?
Peter Thompson.
Peter Thompson. Yes.
Yeah. And those folks I know well. I'm just thinking more someone who's really in the system. I don't want to say bureaucracy in a negative sense, but people that make things happen within the UNFCCC Secretariat. Whether there's anybody there that's had a particular, would have the role of really helping move things through the system, and could be a champion within the actual bureaucracy of the UNFCCC. So we can, if there aren't any names within that system that people are aware of or have been dealing with, we can chase that up through various the contacts that we have.
Yeah, at the highest and broadest level, going through Peter and colleagues would be a good way to go, because they have the finger on it broadly.
Yeah,
and then the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission, in terms of
who we know well, and we have an MOU with them.
Yeah, and they help organize Oceans Day.
Yeah, of course.
So, getting a voice at Oceans Day is one good opportunity.
Yeah. Yeah, and also with John's point, I think maybe if anyone, John or you or others know, we can chase up trying to find who's the key, who would be a key person within the UK government as well. That would be sort of the ocean carbon contact point. Would be I think a critical piece in terms of getting time and space in at COP26, but in the run up.
Yeah, I think Philip Williamson is one of the key authors of the Ocean CDR report for the UK government. So I think he would be a really great guy to link in with.
Okay. Thank you. And who we're already reaching out to in terms of our overall work. So yeah, very good. Thank you. Okay. Let's unless there's any other thoughts on that intergovernmental and COP26 process, just to not to go too far kind of back to some of the earlier discussions we've had as we got going here with this, in terms of the scope and what we're working on. Actually, sorry, this reminds me, Steve. One other question I had was what's your sense of the development of a buyer's market, a buyer's group on coastal and ocean carbon, or coastal and ocean carbon credits as a part of a broader sort of carbon buyers group? Do you see that emerging in any of the work that you've been doing?
Interesting. It tends to be more competitive. It's an interesting idea about buyers group. And if Amy's still here, I wonder what her experience has been in other aspects. But
kind of competitive in the sense that you were saying earlier, some of the corporates that are basically wanting to lock in a carbon credit opportunity and not have it go to market and basically be able to support it, but also then be the holder of those credits just as part of their implementing their strategy and their commitments.
Yes, in that regard. And and if credits do come to market, then they're competing against each other to purchase the credits. So it is that kind of environment right now. But it would be interesting to have a broad fund of investment. There are funds developing where there's the opportunity to gather finance together under a collective agreement of some sort. But I don't know that, my colleague Moritz would know a lot about the details there, but I can't speak right now.
Okay.
I'm curious what Amy knows.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't know too much more about that. I know some other colleagues at Verra have been more involved with trying to set up or like consider almost like buyer's funds for other types of projects, like RED projects, but I haven't been too involved. And just as a standard setting organization, we're always kind of a step removed from any of the sale or purchase of credits.
Right. John, did you have a comment on that as well?
I was just going to say that Stripe made their purchases yesterday, didn't they? In six carbon removal technologies, and Running Tide was one of those, which is carbon removal by sinking kelp.
Right.
Yeah, but so obviously an interesting pull from Stripe, who are also investing in the R&D side of things. So.
Right. Were there any? Was Running Tide the only of the marine or coastal ones that they invested in?
No, I think Sea Change was another one, which was experimental electrochemical processes for sequestering CO2 in seawater. Yeah, those are probably the closest sort of marine ones. But I know some of the people involved in this group applied for the Stripe process. So
yeah,
Stripe have been showing quite a lot of interest.
Yeah, and that they've been indicating they'd be happy to come and speak to the roundtable at some point. Their climate folks. So thanks for that update. Okay. Sorry, back to the sort of overall picture, just to wrap up the meeting today. A little bit of a consideration of the sort of where we're at and where things are going on the broader scale. We've quickly, with these events every month, gotten into fairly with some great speakers and coverage of topics and content. There's some really good specific discussions. Overall, we had mapped out this scope and purpose as we were getting going, and I think not to get into an overall review of this, but this is held pretty steady and provided a good architecture for convening and a sense of scope and purpose. So I'll just move through these, and these are all available. I can send the slides around, but particularly then to start to take it a bit further into our consideration of what success looks like, and some of the things that we've been covering in a topic specific way as we've moved through the calls over the last few months, in creating this structure and process for collaboration and market development, and really getting into the pipeline development, for the lack of a better word for now, so that the business and investment community know where they can go, and we're bringing in the businesses that are developing the opportunities and linking that to the investment community. I've been regularly making sure our Ocean Investor Roundtable group is aware of this effort here, this community, and some of you on the call today are from that network within the WOC, and we continue to look for ways to help get the ocean, coastal, and coastal CDR and restoration developments in front of the investment community. And so always happy to hear, interested to hear the opportunities or suggestions people have for doing that. As we've talked about today, then policymakers and the science community, key stakeholders here for what we're doing, and developing the ways in which we can ensure that they are informed and engaged. And I think some good thoughts that came out earlier in our discussion as part of this overall engaging of the stakeholder community. And we do link in well and have an ongoing, and evolving working relationship with the broader sort of networks and platforms. I'll use Ocean Visions in particular as an example. In fact, they've then invited me to be on their stakeholder the leadership committee that covers other stakeholders, and we see our work continuing that goes back the best part of the last decade, continuing to coalesce the business and investment community that can link in into those broader platforms and efforts on ocean and coastal CDR. And so it's not competitive at all, but very complementary and collaborative in that sense, and that we will continue to specialize in the private sector side of this. Any other thoughts on what's on the screen here in terms of what success looks like and what groups we need to engage and what progress we want to achieve with those groups, again, from that basis of a business and investment community engagement and effort to make progress on ocean and coastal CO2 removal. And the barriers question in terms of what's keeping us, and we've talked about that a little bit in terms of the enabling conditions today. Any other thoughts on what kinds of barriers or constraints to moving forward are in front of us?
One barrier that's been cited to me on multiple occasions is that a fragmented industry has limitations in terms of capital raised. Phrased positively, I think if we can organize a coalition of the willing, that it would be possible to draw multiple factors higher capital to the industry than would otherwise be possible. So I see the opportunity for us to organize our activities in a coherent framework, possibly using the WOC as a communication channel, and from that be able to raise an order of magnitude more capital for the industry and the key stakeholders and key methodologies than would otherwise be possible. So I'd like to put that out as a possible objective.
Thanks, Brian. This has come up a bit from in different ways, not quite as explicit, but along the same lines. You want to elaborate on that a bit? What would that look like? Would that be really the enterprises themselves that are needing the funding, really having a common kind of almost like an industry association level of coherence to be able to then collectively be available for our work, and as you say, with and through the WOC, which we'd be happy and very interested to do to engage the investors, particularly larger scale investors?
I'll describe it in the context of a tale of two disciplines. We once had, well, let's see, if you look at the field of astronomy and oceanography, for example, we have a number of positive and not so positive examples. I think we all know the runaround for, let's say, National Science Foundation in oceanography. And, there are a number of institutions in the United States and overseas that compete for funds, and the acceptance rates for the National Science Foundation grants has dropped to 10 or 15%, can be quite discouraging for researchers. Now, the astronomers have something called the decadal survey, and it's not a decadal survey of stars, it's a decadal survey of astronomers. And what they do every decade is they go around and really poll the entire community. What are your research priorities? What are your development priorities? That decadal survey rolls up into a census, if you will, that the International Astronomical Union gets together, and they actually say, here's our research priorities for the coming 10 years. Here's what we really care about. Then they go to Congress, they get approval for a $3 billion space telescope, and they don't pass go, they don't collect $200, they don't go to NSF, they go straight to Congress because they're well organized and doing well, they get the big bucks, okay? So my appeal is that we need the decadal survey of the marine environment for regenerating ecosystems, for building sustainable livelihoods, and for measuring carbon export. We need to be well coordinated. If we can be well coordinated, I've had bankers approach me and say, we want to put 100 million into this industry, but it's way too fragmented. You guys aren't talking to each other. So we need to be doing that. We need to set our priorities, go forward with a coherent framework, and then raise an order of magnitude more capital than we could otherwise.
That's really compelling. And some great examples. Thoughts on that from around the table?
Yeah, I was, oh, go on.
Go ahead, go ahead.
Go ahead, John.
I was just saying, building a consensus is been a real challenge in the ocean space. You know, for the last COP I was at was the Copenhagen one. You know, and there was a lead-up meetings for that for the ocean, and there was a real lack of consensus on what was required. You know, and only now are we seeing these types of discussions about. I like Brian's idea of the nutrient value chain. You know, it's thinking about the whole system. So if we can bring a more coherent consensus of what's required, you know, obviously it has to address all the scientific issues, the risks, the permanence. But if we can bring that together as a coherent voice, I think it could be really powerful.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, John, for that. And I'd like to add, I've learned a lot about consensus and consent recently, and I would highly recommend a book that just came out maybe 18 months ago called Brave New Work. And it's all about moving from a consensus approach where everyone has to approve of everything and things can go very slowly, to a consent, which is removal of objections and good enough to try. In other words, that's how we can come together through forums like this one, is to really develop a sense of the ecosystem, a sense of how we are bringing complementary skill sets to the table. And, you know, if we want to go fast, we can go alone. But if we want to go far, we should go together. And together means coordinating activities. It means identifying and honoring the great complementary skills that we're all bringing to this forum and to the table. And then recognizing how if we build a coherent ecosystem of capability, we can raise orders of magnitude more capital and accelerate the development of this industry and field far faster than we could with balkanized approach.
Thank you, Brian. You're really making a compelling case here. There, someone else was, I didn't quite see who it was, wanted to make a comment.
Salvador.
Yeah, I'm a lot newer in this industry and this than everyone else, and I've been basically since March really getting a grasp of, you know, the challenge of getting people to fund projects, ocean CDR projects. And I think what you guys are doing at COP is going to help, I hope, with, especially with governance, which was a weak spot on our Stripe proposal. And it's because there's a lot of uncertainty, and I get a feeling just from the experience that I've, you know, with other people that I've been networking with, that this is the year for ocean CDR, that it's actually picking up. It's a lot louder than it ever has been, and that really excites me. And I'm networking like crazy, trying to get the message out there about this potential. And, you know, Brian, what he does say makes sense. It's like, you know, has it been tested, or, you know, is it legal? Is it, you know, you're introducing something foreign into the ocean, or you're doing something that isn't already natural? But I always remind folks, you know, an oil rig in the middle of the ocean also isn't natural. But you seem to not be batting an eye over that at all. Anyhow, I think there's a point to what Brian is proposing, that we're stronger in numbers. You know, 300 Spartans wouldn't have, you know, they got together and held their shields together and worked together. I think that's where Brian's getting at, and I like his idea. I'm not as eloquent as him though. Thank you.
Thanks. No, it's all good, Brian. And so this actually really echoes some of the notes I've been gradually making for myself over the last 4 or 5 months. Brian, I'd like to suggest that you and I get on a call together to explore this a bit further and see if we can prepare some content and come back to the roundtable with some developments or some suggestions and more discussion on this. And I think, you know, echoing Salvador's point that, you know, the momentum is, and as we all know, that's why we're all here around the table, you know, the momentum is increasing significantly, and the time is now in the run up to COP26 to work to get ourselves more organized. So I will follow that up with you.
Hey, Paul, it's Sam Walker here. Just to kind of double down on that and guess bring WOC into this a little bit more. I mean, I can't remember if that was Brian or somebody else that made a comment about, really trying to build an industry. I mean, many of us are, trying to build businesses, individual businesses as we go. But I think one thing we can do easily now without any additional sort of effort other than just changing the way we talk about it is making sure that each of us is talking about this as the development of an industry and not simply individual companies. And in doing that, we are echoing a common message. And I think, the forum that you create here, it's obviously sort of a coalition of the willing already and those that are sort of in the know. But that is something the World Ocean Council, I think, has been working to do, and ably so over the last couple of years, is to demonstrate that there are new industries emerging and not just sort of new variations of something existing in the form of a new company or a different company. And so I think that's something that we can already do, and many of us probably already are, but is to just highlight that piece around, we're trying to build a new industry here, which is a little difficult, I think, for some people to grasp, right? That is a massive concept for people to sort of come to grips with, like, oh yeah, right, you're creating a new industry. Humans have already exhausted that pool of things. But I would submit that that's something that doesn't cost you anything at all, and kind of can be a rallying cry for each of us in turn. So just something to think about.
Yeah, I'll double down on that, Sam, and I'll say, we have an opportunity to move from the history of extraction to something that's much more regenerative. We've run into many marine ecologists who, quite frankly, don't have any living memory of any technology in the ocean that's been regenerative. It's usually been extractive. And I think there are opportunities to showcase some of the new dimensions of this new industry. And then furthermore, to identify the common interests. I'm really impressed with the complementary skill sets and areas of expertise around this forum. And by identifying those skill sets and opportunities, I think we could build a much more coherent industry base that can work together very effectively.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I mean, totally with you. And that regenerative sort of talking point, or the talking point about the regenerative nature of this is key. It's one we use all the time. I mean, the sort of comparison we use as a company is, it's basically been hunter-gatherer, right, to this point in the ocean space for the most part. Even in terms of some of like the mineral extraction, it's hunter-gatherer type stuff. And yet look at the efficiencies that we've gained in terrestrial space over centuries of human sort of occupation in different places, and we need to get to that same place in the ocean. The differences, of course, are manifest, but it can be done, and that's the opportunity, right?
I agree, Sam, and we've got the legacy of Jacques Cousteau to contribute to the admonition in the last century to move from hunting to a more agrarian approach, where the really sustaining. And one reason we've framed things in terms of permaculture is, the seaweed forestation and the other things that we'll be doing are all about regenerating those natural ecosystems with a sustainable yield. But also, that means a lot of the resources are going back to nature and ensuring that we can rebuild life in the ocean.
This is a great discussion. I'm loving the energy and the ideas and the direction here. It sounds like, and I know we'll coming up in a few minutes on our 90-minute mark. We should really be, to harness this, to really try and create, I guess, a more formal structure then, based on taking this coalition of the willing and really structuring it into a group of private sector and associated players that want to form a more formal structured association that I think provides that, as Brian was starting out by saying, provides then the collective ability to unleash unleash the capital, but also I would say to shape the policy and as Salvador was saying, the governance piece that may be a constricting factor, and the science piece that's a constraint and a need to really take what we've kind of loosely been developing here as a community of practice and interested parties to a more formal formal grouping. And I'd yeah, let's pick this up and run with it. I would suggest that we get maybe a smaller working group, perhaps. I'm just thinking of really next steps to keep this momentum up. A smaller group of people that would want to sit down and really start drawing this up.
Sounds good.
Salvador, do you got your hand up there?
My idea is just, I was just thinking, if you go to any one of our websites, you don't really have an organization backing you or behind you of like-minded, like good people who are trying to move forward with, the right science methodology, or and I think that's probably the most important, that that ultimately that they would have that goal, and that they're working with folks that are working to be governed or have governance, or be legal. So I think based on what I've just been hearing, the way I'm interpreting it is we could come together, that would help, and there would be moving forward, that there would be companies aligned with the same sort of methodologies. Or I guess that's what I'm trying to say is we want to move forward with an organization that trusts what we're at least trying to do, even if we're in the very early stages. The science may not be 100% clear, but we're trying to get there. And we're being transparent. That's another thing, is that the data should be transparent. Our efforts should be transparent. We need to have a great relationship with all stakeholders, especially the public, who are the ones that are, that will be more concerned about what we are doing as actors with our oceans, in our oceans, to, in our case, sequester CO2 in mass. So it's like, who backs you, who's behind you? If you're a nobody, it's a little challenging. There's marketing ways to get people to become aligned with you, or to, in just interacting with them, they get to know you and they begin to trust you. So I know from that end, there's a way of building trust, but it is challenging when you aren't the named brand. So I'm interested in participating or helping any which way in moving those discussions forward.
Thank you, Salvador. I think you've really, and we'll have to close up because of the timing, but touched on these key points of the public. And as Sam's comment was saying about changing perceptions is so important in the whole social license aspect. So what I will do is capture this idea quickly, and thank you for sparking this, Brian, and put it out to the whole group that's been invited consistently over the months to this roundtable, to say that we're having a smaller kind of working task team to explore this and tease it out, and see who's interested in participating, and not waiting until a month from now to have that discussion, but seeing if we can pull together a call. And I'm thinking, Brian, Sam, Salvador, John, as some of the, you've been both vocal here today on that, and hopefully, there'll be some others interested in really the idea of an industry association, for lack of a better word right now, to create that formal, structured ability to engage the rest of the world on the future of coastal and ocean CO2 removal and ocean restoration and regeneration associated with that. So if that sounds like the right way forward, we'll do that as part of our role here and at the World Ocean Council, and see what, let's work together to explore that fully and hopefully move it forward if there's a critical mass of interested parties to do so.
That sounds great, Paul. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks. We're a little bit over time. Really appreciate all the energy and involvement here. And Steve had to sign off a little while ago, but really grateful for him to have come and brought all his knowledge and experience into the meeting, and continue to be involved here. And we will follow up as just discussed. So really look forward to it. Thanks so much for making your time available today. Bye now.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks,
Bye,
everyone.
everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Fred, I don't know if you wanted to have a, let me just stop the recording here, but if you wanted, while we're both online here, to touch base a little bit.